to a sociological fraternity who converge to discuss him today. Love him, hate him, but we cannot do without him. Often sociology students complain, I included, of how difficult it is to understand his writings, part of which is because of translation from his original works in French. At this point, allow me to introduce our guest speaker for this seminar, Professor Sheena Jain. She is currently professor in the Department of Sociology, Jamia Millia University, New Delhi. Among her forthcoming publications is a chapter on structure and culture for a textbook of sociology and book reviews on sociological bulletin and summary. In view of the complexity of understanding Pierre Bourdieu, it is intellectually courageous for Professor Jain to have taken up the study of Pierre Bourdieu, for she is one of those rare scholars who chose to study Bourdieu as part of her PhD thesis. Over the years, she has taught Bourdieu and made him accessible to South Asian scholars. This is what makes this seminar significant. The temporal location of the South Asian University as a new university, aspiring to be an international one, in a neoliberal period, is reminiscent of Bourdieu's work on higher education and his critics on university systems. He also saw universities as emancipatory. Therefore, while building the blocks of a new institution such as SAU, we can learn from Bourdieu's work. Pierre Bourdieu also advocated internationalism, a theme again relevant to the goals of SAU. He believed in the unity of theory and practice and the indispensability of one to the other. Our chair for this seminar is Dr. Chudamani Basnet, Department of Sociology, South Asian University. A sociologist, his research interests include political sociology, cultural sociology, structured inequality, and historical sociology. Our discussant for today is Dr. Malika Shakya, Department of Sociology, South Asian University, an economic anthropologist. Her research interests are anthropology of work, ethnicity and social movements, borderlands, regionalism, and the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Saroj. We have today a very interesting topic, reading Bourdieu today, or in other words, contemporary relevance of Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu has been an intellectual heavyweight of the 20th century, and his influence can be felt in, of course, the social sciences, particularly in sociology and anthropology. And his substantive areas ranges from housing industry to arts, from higher education to photography. So he has actually commented and wrote on virtually everything. So at some point, he has characterized sociology as socioanalysis, akin to psychoanalysis. Just like psychoanalysts uncover hidden causes in individuals, so the job of sociology is to uncover power relations. And true to his promise, and I particularly like his work on cultural sociology. To be precise, his unmasking of cultural pretension of French bourgeoisie. So I very much like that work. And one critic has said that, okay, Bourdieu might be wrong, he might have exaggerated things, but one thing is sure about Pierre Bourdieu, that is, it's always good to think with Bourdieu. So today, we are going to think with Bourdieu, and fortunately, we have got a very capable hand to navigate us through to this big ocean called Pierre Bourdieu. Now I invite Professor Sheena Jain to deliver her lecture.
Thank you very much for this class, and great thanks also to the making me a participant in this very distinguished seminar series. And thank you very much for your introduction. I can see that there is a keenness to engage with Bourdieu's work, and also a certain apprehension of the difficulty of the task. However, what I intend to do is not so much to go into the details of his contribution, but rather to begin with, to locate his contribution and its distinctiveness in relation to other contemporary trends in theory. And I would be partly or mostly reading out my presentation, but I hope that's acceptable. Yes. Well, to share with you what I think makes reading Bourdieu today meaningful and significant, I'll begin with a general and somewhat banal observation. And this is that most of us read what is written by social thinkers with the legitimate expectation that their words would, in some sense, deepen our understanding of the world we live in, that they may take us closer to the truths of human social existence. But this simple expectation and its realization are processes that today, more than perhaps ever before, viewed as being extremely complicated. For we are being sensitized in many ways to the fact that the journey between words and the world is complex, uncertain, and even impossible according to some schools of thought. Now I will unpack this general idea in relation to some intellectual traditions that have historically influenced sociology, and then move on to focus on Bourdieu's position on the subject. And this, I think, will enable us, as I said, to contextualize the distinctiveness of Bourdieu's sociology and hence sharpen our experience of reading Bourdieu today. An engagement with the relation between words and the world had animated the interpretation of texts as early as during the Greek Enlightenment in the West, and characterized the hermeneutics of the scriptures during the Reformation, of the Bible in particular. This tradition evolved, as you probably know, into the modern hermeneutics of Schleiermacher in the 18th century, who wrote about understanding the text at first as well and then even better than its author. And this in turn gave a spur to the more sociological enterprise of studying social action through understanding its meaning for actors, and more generally to the idea of interpreting history and even society itself as if it is a text, that is, as analogous to a text. The underlying assumption, of course, was that social reality is a meaningful reality which can be grasped interpretatively, much as we understand meanings through oral and written communication. But already in the work of Willem Delvey, which marks a transition from the interpretation of written text to the interpretation of social action, and more emphatically in the subsequent work of Gadamer, and then of Habermas and Ricoeur, deciphering meaning was seen as a task fraught with complexities, and it evoked varied responses from them. Gadamer, for instance, was concerned about the fact that the interpreter himself or herself brings something of her own to bear on the reading, so that he spoke of prejudices whose effect, however, could be positively resolved by what he termed a fusion of horizons, that is, through the shared socio-cultural traditions of the scholar and the subject. For Habermas and Ricoeur, on the other hand, the socio-cultural context was not sufficient to reveal meaning. Its deeper layers had to be unearthed and perceived by methods of explanation and not interpretation alone, akin to those used by psychoanalysis in the case of individual neurosis, and also through the mediation of structuralist analysis, according to Ricoeur. The hidden transcript that would surface through what was termed a depth hermeneutics would enable a discernment of how distortions, ellipses, and contradictions are patterned by elements such as power and desire, which are obscured by a naive reading. This more complex rendering of how the social text can be read seemed to turn the earlier dualism of understanding versus explanation into a complementarity, challenging the rigid separation of the methods of the human sciences from those of the natural sciences. And though Weber too had proposed a coming together of interpretive understanding and causal explanation, in Habermas's and Ricoeur's work, these modes of knowing were to engage with social action encompassing not just subjective consciousness and overt behavior, as in the case of Weber, but also the dimensions of the unconscious, of desire, and of power. Moreover, while for Weber, Verstehen was the primary method for explaining social action, even when supplemented by scientific techniques of a positivistic kind, the meshing of interpretive and explanatory methods took a very different form in the conceptions of Habermas and Ricoeur. And of course, their perspectives were also very far removed from the idea of a unified science which advocates of a positivist methodology for the human sciences, such as Hempel and Nagel had proposed. Ricoeur argued, for instance, that neurotic behavior lies at the very intersection of intentional action and unconscious compulsion, so that the radical disjunction between reason and cause is unhelpful and inappropriate. And it is this, according to him, that makes the language of psychoanalysis a mixed discourse. He thus introduced the notion of a semantics of desire to suggest that psychoanalysis discloses a dimension of experience where meaning and force coincide, so that there is a need to develop an intermediate concept, that of desire, as being at once a motive and a cause. It follows that psychoanalysis and the social sciences in general must evolve a framework that integrates the moments of understanding and explanation into a systematic and coherent methodology. While the details of the dialectic of interpretation that Ricoeur then elaborates need not concern us here, it is significant that he incorporates structuralism within it, in consonance with his view that social phenomena are semiological in nature, but not without a hermeneutic supplement that aims to move from the structures of text, whether oral or written, or whether of social life read as a text, to their referential dimension, including the world which is not hidden in the text, but, as he terms it, but which opens up in front of it. In other words, a possible world which is not bound to a particular situation, though suggested by it. However, while this aspect of interpretation gave it a subversive potential, because you think of possibilities other than what exists, Ricker sees the link between interpretation and critique as always partial, fragmentary, and limited. This is both because of the plurivocality of texts that do not permit of a last word, even as competing interpretations vie for validation through a process of argumentation akin to that of juridical reasoning, so that a particular interpretation may be validated. And also because, being part of the very world we seek to understand, there is no position outside of history and society from which we can survey the social historical sphere. Furthermore, insofar as hermeneutics abandons the positivist model of pure positivist explanation, it is at the same time bound to reject the idea of a disjuncture between science and ideology. All knowledge of the social world is viewed as being preceded and supported by a relation of belonging, an ideological relation in the primordial sense, upon which we can never fully reflect. In contrast, in Habermas's theoretical framework, the discerning of ideological distortions is a major concern, as you probably know, and thus implies the possibility of knowing the truth, with reference to which distortions may be defined as such. So on the one hand, you have the impossibility of a last word in interpretation in Ricker, and here you have the possibility of arriving at the truth, because only then can you say what is distorted. I will not go into the details of his ideas of communicative rationality and his notion of the ideal speech situation, but would like to draw your attention to the fact that his concept of truth, which is based on a rejection of the centrality of the subject-object relation in the positivist tradition, which he terms the philosophy of consciousness, is in fact one that is supported by arguments for an alternate conception which is ultimately dependent on subject-subject relations, because it is through rational argumentation in the kind of potential for the creation of an ideal speech situation, which he says language always carries, that you arrive at the truth. It is not a solitary ego perceiving an object, but subjects amongst themselves critically arguing and arriving at the truth. So it is a very different conception of truth, and though it moves away from positivism, it does not lapse then into the relativism which was also characteristic of certain philosophies of science at that time, such as the work of Kuhn and Ferdinand. While it may seem that we have digressed very far from the theme of reading social reality as a text, I do think that an exploration of whether and how a social science reading can discern the truth is of relevance. And we have encountered through our discussion of Gadamer, Ricker, and Habermas some divergent paths in the process. However, insofar as language is the vehicle used for the representation of truth by all the traditions discussed so far, and in fact given its apotheosis in Habermas's idea that linguistic rationality is the ultimate form of reason and an incontrovertible basis for arriving at the truth, it follows that a positive link between words and world is regarded as axiomatic by these thinkers, however however complex the journey linking them may be. It is against this backdrop that the impact of Derrida's radical hermeneutics can be measured. That is, of Derridian deconstruction, which argues the inefficacy of language itself as a communicative medium. Consequently, the notion that a text is a unified, coherent whole, perhaps communicating a message, and in some more general way representing or recreating a reality external to it, is shown to be an illusion. This is because language is regarded as inescapably metaphysical, for it is made up of signifiers that only refer to that which transcends them, that is the signified. And this transcending of the empirical facticity of the signifier by an ideally conceived signified is metaphysical according to Derrida. And though the structuralisms of Saussurian linguistics and Levi-Straussian anthropology were attempts to break free from metaphysics and to move to science, the science of science, the science of structure, they still relied, according to Derrida, on metaphysical assumptions. Thus, for instance, he argues that there are latent metaphysical strains in retaining as natural, in quotes, such oppositions as those between speech and writing, mind and body, inside and outside, good and evil, etc., including male and female. Moreover, their use in both tradition and in more recent sciences suggests that in practice, one pole in these oppositions is privileged over the other. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea. Significantly, Derrida maintains that though we cannot imagine or bring about the end of metaphysics, we can undertake a critique of it from within by identifying and reversing the hierarchies it has established. However, deconstructive critique differs from critique in the Kantian sense, which is defined in opposition to dogmatism, because for Derrida, language, being metaphysical, is always dogmatic. Thus, while deconstruction may challenge a particular dogmatism, it cannot escape it altogether. Nevertheless, as again you no doubt would be aware, Derrida's critique of hierarchized binaries is an idea that has been very influential in the field of literary criticism, of course, and it has also fertilized the work of many social science researchers. It focuses on a dimension of social reality that is pervasive and deep-rooted, and which, as I will discuss a bit later, takes on a different conceptual form in Bourdieu's work. At this point, it may be meaningful to consider briefly the status of truth in Derrida's deconstruction, because we've been talking about how the truth of social reality as a text may or may not be accessible depending on whether you are in the tradition of hermeneutics or you're a Habermasian thinker and so on. At this point, it is, as I said, meaningful to consider the status of truth in Derrida's deconstruction. It has been observed that rather than denying the possibility of truth, Derrida may be interpreted as regarding truth as trivial and not the main issue for his concerns. Moreover, according to him, there may be too many statements in a text which are true, and the practical difficulty is in selecting from the plethora of truths a useful subset. In this sense, there is no such thing as truth in itself, but only a surfeit of it. In case you're getting impatient about not having come to Bourdieu, all this is a precursor and a kind of background against which we will look at what is distinctive about Bourdieu. So, according to Derrida, there is an undecidability of textual meaning. And this holds for philosophical texts as well, which are in fact among the texts that Derrida has engaged with in a major way, though philosophers traditionally, as we know, believe themselves to be stating truths and write accordingly. Very much in the tradition of hermeneutics from Gadamer on, Derrida maintains that there is no uniquely privileged standpoint for understanding, including any special authority of the speaker or author for determining the meaning of what is said or written. Moreover, according to him, methods of interpretation must desist from the search for either hidden meaning or some causal relation to an aspect of external reality. So again, the contrast between, say, Habermas and a perspective like this. Text, in fact, can refer only to other texts, generating an intersecting and indefinitely expandable web called intertextuality. As one scholar who draws upon Derrida's reference to Plato's frequent presentation of writing as a drug, or in Greek as a pharmakon, puts it, in Derrida's view, the narcotic effect of words leads us to take reality as a dream, or dreams as reality, and philosophy loses sight of the difference. If in what I have said so far, I have mapped in outline certain salient intellectual traditions that have engaged with problems of interpretation, analysis, and representation of social reality and truth, this, as I said, has been in order to facilitate the location of Bourdieu's sociological contribution from a perspective which is different from the ones usually adopted. Thus, we may, to begin with, look at his conception of sociology as a post-positivist science, and how he draws upon the French epistemological tradition of philosophers of science such as Canguilhem and Bachelard, including their notion of truth, to extend their tradition creatively from the domain of the natural sciences to the study of society. This is, in fact, a dimension of his work that has by and large been neglected. We may also, so this is the first thing we'll briefly discuss, we may also reflect on how, in doing so, he charts a course for sociology which, even though it is based on a critique of positivism and is cognizant of the profound social significance of the symbolic, does not succumb to the idealism of the hermeneutic tradition. In other words, the articulation of the material and the symbolic in his oeuvre may be seen as a valuable contribution towards overcoming the analytical impasse created by the standoff between materialist and idealist positions, though he does this from the standpoint of a materialist. Thirdly, insofar as his approach, like that of Habermas, is characterized by a fusion of the conventionally opposed modes of understanding and explanation, it may be rewarding to consider the form it takes in his work and why he is critical of the Habermasian version. Next, as for the postmodern negation of the philosophy of representation, as in the case of Derrida, Bourdieu takes on board its critique of structuralism as metaphysics. But he also reconstitutes the analysis of binary oppositions in terms of his concept of practical logic, thus placing it within a sociological framework, namely that of a theory of practice. Moreover, Bourdieu finds deconstruction itself to be metaphysical and thus severed from socio-historical realities, as it may be noted he regards all philosophies to be. That's Bourdieu's take on philosophy. Bourdieu's sociology may also be seen as offering an answer to the postmodern critique of science, while being concerned at the same time about its negative aspects and forms embedded in particular contexts. He thus partakes of the Enlightenment tradition, but not without distinguishing between its varying social manifestations, such as, for instance, in the form of false as well as authentic universalisms. Finally, in anticipation of the profile of Bourdieu's intellectual project that may emerge from a discussion of the themes enumerated above, we may note a strong link between the particular conception of sociology as a science that he practiced as a scholar and his active involvement in movements for social change, ranging from relatively low-key interventions in cultural policy in France to his widely known participation in the European movement against neoliberalism. This link, moreover, foregrounds an extremely important and complex aspect of the relation between words and the world, namely that of praxis. I will now proceed to discuss briefly each of the themes listed above. While Bachelard is familiar to most students of sociology, I guess, mainly via his notion of epistemological breaks used by Althusser to distinguish between the pre-scientific marks and the scientific marks of capital, Bourdieu's sociology owes much more to the Bachelardian heritage than the ideas of a discontinuous history of science, which is what epistemological breaks refers to, and of the opposition between common sense and science, because a pre-capital Marx is ideological, whereas post-capital Marx is, or capital, Marx of capital is science, is scientific. So there is a dichotomy between common sense or ideology and science. And this is something that Bachelard initially put forward in his conception of science and was taken up by Althusser, and Bourdieu, in a sense, accepts it. More profoundly than Althusser, who in his later work dismisses the Bachelardian influence as a form of idealism, Bourdieu follows Bachelard's blueprint for scientific practice that rejects positivism and builds on an alternative principle of knowledge creation. It is in the book called The Craft of Sociology, written in 1968 by Bourdieu with a team of scholars and put together with a pedagogic intent, that the salience of the tradition of historical epistemology for Bourdieu's conception of a science of society is most clearly expressed. It includes excerpts from the writings of Bachelard, of Canguilhem, and Duhem, together with others from the sociological tradition, and discusses their significance for social research. Not surprisingly then, it is an influence, that is, historical epistemology is an influence that pervades the entire corpus of Bourdieu's writings. And while much can be said about it, I will limit myself here to identifying only those elements of it which have been crucial in shaping Bourdieu's sociology in a distinctive way. Thus, for instance, while for Bourdieu as for Bachelard, the struggle for truth is necessarily endless, it is nevertheless a struggle which is worthwhile. This conviction is undergirded by a notion of truth as rectified error, in which scientific truths are seen as proceeding progressively towards greater approximation, but always only an approximation to absolute truth, via breaks that call into question earlier theories. Now, this notion significantly diverges from positivism's linear and cumulative conception in which the status of truth as absolute is unquestioned, as well as it differs from all forms of relativism, because it is worthwhile to search for truth. It is also distinct from a position that abandons the search for truth on the basis of an ontology of the undecidability of meaning or of the impossibility of representation, as in Derrida. Very much in keeping with this basic premise, Bourdieu describes his concepts as heuristic and his theories as open-ended constructs, whose real meaning thus lies in their use in actual empirical research. So, truth is not something absolute. Concepts refer to the approximation of truth, and so on. In the same spirit, even as Bourdieu, like Bachelard, views the errors of common sense or pre-notions, as he calls them, as obstacles to be overcome and rectified by scientific truths, he does not regard as justified the assumption by the scientist of a position of omniscience. Moreover, the fact that sociological constructions are constructions of constructions is one that, apart from being indicative of the difference between the subject matter of the social sciences and of the natural sciences, means that sociology is located in a terrain already characterized by contests for defining the truth of the social world and not among scientists alone. Thus, truth for Bourdieu is the generalized relativity of points of view, apart from the one that constitutes them as such, by constituting the space of points of view. So he locates points of view within his notion of the social space. And it is this relative truth which is viewed in terms of social positions and spaces that is truth for Bourdieu. This in turn evokes a notion of objectivity which is opposed to the absolutist pretensions of the classical position that ideally excludes all points of view except those of the detached observer. And once more, even as Bourdieu rejects the ideal of detached observation, he draws inspiration from Bachelard's emphasis on the scientific value of reflective and critical thought as against the grounding of knowledge in presumed perceptual passivity, and innovates to accommodate the specificity of the social domain and offers in place of either relativism or constructivism, even though he's talking about points of view, he doesn't therefore become a constructivist or a relativist. He in fact proposes a form of reflexive objectivity, which he terms participant objectivation. This significantly is proposed as an alternative to the method of participant observation, the tool most commonly used particularly by social anthropologists, and in which a claim to objectivity is based on an identification of the subject with object. What Bourdieu's participant objectivation demands instead is an objectivization not just of the scientist's social origins, position, and trajectory in social space, including, say, social and religious membership and beliefs, gender, age, nationality, etc., but also his or her particular position within the microcosm of a discipline, whether sociology or anthropology. Only when this is objectified can the relation to the object be objectified, and the interest in objectivating the object and the representations it sustains be bracketed. As Bourdieu puts it, viewing the process as a dialectical one, and I quote, to each advance in the knowledge of the social conditions of production of scientific subjects corresponds an advance in the knowledge of the scientific object, and conversely. Importantly, this form of reflexivity is different from the kind proposed by other scholars such as Alvin Goldner, which focus on the individual psychological propensities of the researcher. Moreover, in the case of Bourdieu, it should not be misunderstood as implying that the researcher must put nothing of herself or himself into her research. On the contrary, the researcher should, and I quote, refer continually to his own experience, but not, as is too often the case, even among the best researchers, in a guilty, unconscious, or uncontrolled manner. In fact, keeping firmly in mind the irreducible specificity of the logic of practice, we must avoid depriving ourselves of that quite irreplaceable scientific resource, that is, social experience previously subjected to sociological critique, the social experience of the researcher himself or herself. This brings us to the question of reality and realism in Bourdieu's work, which has often been misunderstood. Far from the naive realism of the empiricist, Bourdieu adopts what he terms, following Bachelard, a rational realism. What this means, and I quote, is that the epistemological vector points from the rational to the real, and not, as all philosophers from Aristotle to Bacon profess, from the real to the general. End of quote. It implies, thus, a primacy of theory and a dialectic between theory and verification at every stage of the scientific process. It is therefore what Bachelard terms an applied rationalism, in which the values of coherence, that is a kind of rationality, and fidelity to the real, that is realism, are closely associated. Importantly, however, this does not imply rendering the empirical meaningless, but in fact, as Bourdieu puts it, it requires plunging into the particularity of an empirical reality with the objective of constructing it as a special case of what is possible. That is, an exemplary case in a finite world of possible configurations. For instance, Bourdieu reconstructs the historical genesis of the state by bringing to light the conflicts and confrontations of its early beginnings, and therefore revealing all the discarded possibles to retrieve the possibility that things could have been and still could be otherwise, and then also questioning the possible which among all others was actualized. Furthermore, on the question of the real, Bourdieu specifies that what is real at any point of time is mediated by current theory and existing equipment, whether in the natural or in the social sciences. And that more generally, in Bachelard's words, and I quote, "What is belief in reality? It is essentially the conviction that there is more to an entity than is immediately given." I will conclude my discussion of Bourdieu's conception of science and scientific method by highlighting what I regard as its most distinctive, striking, and powerful characteristic. And this is that, unlike positivism, it does not set up an opposition between the scientific and the human as a projection of the opposition between subject and object. The image of science as a human project, which characterizes the French tradition of historical epistemology, creates a general foundation for a humanistic and embodied science for the study of society as well. Rather than viewing the fact that science is the product of human practice as a limitation whose effects must be systematically minimized and ideally eliminated as positivism aspires to do, this tradition builds upon it positively, underscoring the role of reflective and critical thought, and at the same time avoiding the distortions of subjectivism. Rather than relinquishing the project of the creation of scientific knowledge in favor of some form of hermeneutics based on a dichotomous view of the human and the natural sciences, it in fact forms the basis for a common grounding of the humanities, the social sciences, as well as the natural sciences, even as their substantive differences call forth distinctive methods of study. It is revealing in this context that to read Bourdieu's book called The Rules of Art, in which he analyzes the French literary field by focusing on the work of Flaubert. What it exemplifies is precisely how there's a common grounding to knowledge creation, whether in the humanities or even in art and literary writing. While not opting for hermeneutics in response to a rejection of positivism, Bourdieu simultaneously does not accept the philosophical idealism of that tradition. It's becoming too long.
No.
Are you sure? This takes me to the second theme in my discussion of Bourdieu's contribution and the rewards of reading him today. As is well known, one major source of inspiration for his theory of practice is Marx's thesis on Feuerbach that critiques, on the one hand, those forms of materialism such as Feuerbach's for their objectivism that neglects to regard reality as human practice in a subjective way, and on the other hand, idealism, which develops the subjective dimension but without a grasp of real concrete activity. In Bourdieu's terms, this is what is present in contemporary sociology in the form of an antinomy between a social physics and a social phenomenology, which needs to be superseded by an approach that comes to grips with the principle of the relationship between material properties and symbolic properties. Inasmuch as he accepts the reality of the material world, Bourdieu understands symbolic properties as referring to the perception and appreciation of material properties in their mutual relationships. And it is with regard to the dialectic between the material and the symbolic, which he sees as being a constituent of all human practice, that his concept of habitus assumes special significance and power. Working on a canvas that stretches beyond the confines of Marx's analysis of social practice, Bourdieu ventures, via the concept of habitus, into the world of everyday practice and the springs that animate action and thought in it, ranging from forms of bodily hexes, common sense and myth, to the elaborations of literary, metaphysical and scientific thought. While you're probably familiar with the details of the concept of habitus, what I would like to emphasize here is its ability to move social analysis out of the debilitating influence of the Cartesian mind-body duality, and to highlight the role of embodied forms of knowledge that operate below the level of conscious thought and pattern social reality, even as they are capable of generating novel and creative forms of action in particular conjunctures. In this, the concept is also inherently a critique of the Marxist as well as feminist focus on consciousness raising as a means of initiating radical action. For as embodied subordination, it may be argued that the habitus demands exercises that work towards a symbolic mastery that goes beyond the realm of ideas alone. While it is not possible to discuss here the various specific examples of Bourdieu's analysis of the relationship of the material and the symbolic, it needs to be noted, however, that in a certain sense, his contribution carries forward Marx's analysis of superstructures, which in fact Marx himself left incomplete. And that Bourdieu does this by innovatively synthesizing traditions of analysis that have conventionally been regarded as opposed to each other, such as the Weberian, the Marxist, and the Durkheimian, as well as more contemporary schools such as of structuralism and symbolic interactionism, and then going beyond them to introduce a number of new concepts such as those of symbolic capital and symbolic violence. Bourdieu's engagement with diverse intellectual traditions in order to put forward an original framework of analysis represents in fact a feature which he shares with several contemporary theorists, including, for example, Anthony Giddens and Jürgen Habermas. He also shares with Habermas, as I mentioned earlier, a perspective that integrates understanding and explanation. I will consider how Bourdieu does this briefly and then note the essential point on which he disagrees with Habermas's understanding. To appreciate Bourdieu's version of the integration of explanation and understanding, we need to refer back to his attribution of a positive value to the qualities inhering in science by virtue of the fact that it is the product of human practice. Thus, the method of participant objectivation, which I described, for example, creates the possibility of combining such human experiences as those of emotions, of memories, and even of intuitions, with the equally human capacity to reflect, to reason, and to criticize in order to be able to know social reality scientifically. This form of knowledge creation defies the dualism of understanding and explanation, just as it unties the epistemological knot separating the humanities and the social sciences. Bourdieu, in fact, in his book called The Weight of the World, writes that, and I quote, "Against the old distinction made by William Dilthey, we must posit that understanding and explaining are one." Further, reflecting on the process of interviewing, which is the basis of this study of the effect on people's lives of neoliberalism in France, he notes, and I quote, "Attempting to situate oneself in the place the interviewees occupy in the social space in order to understand them as necessarily what they are, by questioning them from that point on, and to some degree to take their part, is not to affect the phenomenologist's projection of oneself into the other. Rather, it is to give oneself a generic and genetic comprehension of who these individuals are, based on a theoretical or practical grasp of the circumstances of life and the social mechanisms that affect the entire category to which any individual belongs, whether high school students, skilled workers, magistrates, whatever, and a grasp of the conditions inseparably psychological and social associated with a given position and trajectory in social space. In other words, explanation and understanding are of a piece and are intrinsic to sociology. Where Bourdieu finds Habermas's version of the merging of interpretation and explanation wanting is in Habermas's inscription of the logic of truth and its realization in the universal properties of language. According to Bourdieu, there are no trans-historical universals of communication as Habermas supposes, but rather socially instituted and guaranteed forms of communication which prevail in fact in the scientific field, for instance, and give an efficacy to mechanisms of universalization such as the cross controls that are imposed by the logic of competition. But while averse to Habermas's deification of language, Bourdieu nevertheless reposes some confidence in the ability of language to convey meaning and represent reality, though this is understood as existing together with its capacity, language's capacity to dissimulate and even inflict symbolic violence. In fact, language has been an important subject of his sociological analyses, and several of his writings on the subject are compiled in the book called Language and Symbolic Power. His analysis of Heidegger's work, called The Political Ontology of Martin Heidegger, is also an excellent analysis of what a sociological study of the linguistic form of a text, a philosophical text, can reveal. Thus, if Bourdieu locates Habermas's universals of linguistic rationality and all forms of language use within specific socio-historical contexts, he also carries the universals of binary oppositions away from the metaphysical realm and places them within the analytical domain of social practice. While doing so, he does not give them the status of foundational structures, though they may often function as such. Rather, he illuminates their role, that is the role of binaries, in the workings of what he terms practical logic, namely the logic that meets the demands of the urgency of social action, which is an inevitable and constant feature of human existence. True binaries such as yes and no, which moreover are prone to a fuzziness and slippage unlike the logician's logic. So in the heat of the moment, you have to decide yes or no. And that is his way of understanding how in practice the logic you use is of a binary kind, basically. And then it takes on a fuzzy form and perhaps a different kind of slippage can happen. So it is unlike logical logic. As an intrinsic part of social practice, practical logics are also most certainly shaped by social hierarchies, which they reinforce by their action, and can and do enter the constitution of lasting cultural forms, including myths and art, apart from structuring the common sense of everyday life. Thus, Derrida's critique of structuralism's binaries as metaphysical and his insight into their social moorings as hierarchized structures is carried forward by Bourdieu and reconstituted in the framework of sociological analysis. As for Derrida's deconstructions of philosophical texts, these, according to Bourdieu, are far from philosophy themselves and can be described as philosophical games which implicitly respect the conventions of philosophy even in the ritual transgressions that they try to effect. In short, deconstruction is inherently unable to reflect on philosophy, even though it claims to be doing just that. As must be apparent from the discussion so far, Bourdieu places himself on the side of reason and science and of the Enlightenment project more generally, in contrast to the Derridian and other variants of postmodernism. what is perhaps also apparent by now is that his particular notion of science and his practice of the same has little in common with the dominant model of science which has provoked charges of totalitarianism and hubris from postmodern thinkers and has generated a climate of suspicion towards and even an abandoning of all forms of reason. This makes his contribution a significant one, capable of rescuing the project of science in a version which is humanistic and humane from the backlash of incoherence and nihilism that the dominant forms had provoked. As I pointed out earlier, however, this does not mean that Bourdieu is insensitive to the more destructive manifestations of the values upheld by the Enlightenment. To cite an instance from our own times, neoliberalism uses the trope of freedom to promote free markets, which in turn stoke the fires of corporate greed and heightened exploitation. So there's a slippage from freedom to free markets. More generally, reason itself is subject to monopolization by certain social groups, so that the conditions for its universalization have to be created rather than assumed. In this context, Bourdieu talks about the need for a real politic of reason, which also implies a struggle against what he terms the imperialism of the universal. For instance, there can be verbal universalism, which creates a demand, let us say, for the universalization of education, but does not create universally the conditions for its realization. So there are false and authentic forms of universalization which flow from an acceptance or an adherence to Enlightenment values. If we have so far discussed some aspects of Bourdieu's world of social research and practice through an understanding of his words, I would like to close my presentation by reflecting briefly on what these words mean in relation to his engagement with activities aimed at transforming the social world. Perhaps the clearest expression in words of his conviction that certain forms of symbolic practice, including intellectual work, can contribute to processes of social change is the following statement, where he writes that the object of social science is a reality that encompasses all the individual and collective struggles aimed at conserving or transforming reality, particularly those that seek to impose the legitimate definition of reality, whose symbolic efficacy can help to conserve or subvert the established order. Not surprisingly, it was his early experiences in the army and then as a researcher and teacher in colonial Algeria, which was in the throes of an anti-colonial struggle, that inspired him to conceive of social research as a kind of militant craftsmanship that can go beyond a passive observation of reality. It is also what made him acutely aware of the conservatism and arrogance of objectivist forms of knowledge, such as Levi-Straussian structuralism, and also the limitations of phenomenological and existentialist philosophies that conferred on humanity an unlimited capacity for freedom and responded politically to its absence, as in the case of Algeria itself, by ineffectual actions such as the signing of petitions, as Sartre did. What is exemplified by this sketch of Bourdieu's response to the Algerian experience is the impact of Bourdieu's reading of a particular text of social reality, as it were, as well as his reading of texts by other scholars, and its impact on the creation of his own sociological texts and its translation into social practice. In fact, his participation in the movement against neoliberalism was not a sudden change of trajectory, but an expression of an aspect of his commitment to the creation of a humane world that remained constant throughout his life, that he drew attention to the symbolic forms that are crucial to the sustenance of the neoliberal project, ranging from neoclassical economics to the linguistic slippages from liberal to liberation, and that he exhorted intellectuals, artists, and scientists to meet this challenge by exposing through their own symbolic weapons the misrecognition that these forms are creating, was very much in keeping with his insightful analyses of the dialectic of the material and the symbolic. However, Bourdieu's activism generates many questions and perhaps answers others which theory per se cannot grasp. I will therefore conclude with the observation that Bourdieu's use of the term praxeological for his theoretical approach may be a meaningful starting point for exploring in some detail the link between his words and his world, a link that may even shed light on his praxis.
Thank you, Professor Jain, for this wonderful journey from words to the world. Bourdieu has been one of the rare, probably the only sociologist or social scientist that has consistently engaged in epistemological questions. So this boundary, even this bifurcation between words and words, subjectivism and objectivism, phenomenology or structuralism. So these have been Bourdieu's prime concerns during his long journey. So with this note, I invite Dr. Millia to comment. And then subsequently, the floor will be open for questions and discussion.
5 seconds. Thank you so much, Professor Jain, for a very comprehensive and exciting sort of presentation. As Sheena has also mentioned. Okay, let's try this one and see if it makes thank you again for this comprehensive presentation. And as Jamia sort of pointed out, and as I think many of us have come across Bourdieu's career in different walks of life, and it's kind of easy to think of him as among the great sort of scholars who have been adopted in so many different disciplines. Materialistically speaking, be it discussion of art, or be it discussion of militant nationalism, as you rightly said. These are two completely different ends of the spectrum, and then we see Bourdieusian kind of philosophy equally applicable. But then, as you rightly pointed out, he's also among the scholars who's actually not very easy to read. And I think there's a kind of tendency in many cases to have a superficial sort of reading which might misunderstand Bourdieu, or which might actually misinterpret or only partially kind of make sense of what he was trying to say. So in that sense, I think it's really good for students and for us as well to have this comprehensive sort of presentation. And in fact, I was thinking that for those who might be interested in pursuing a study of Bourdieu further, they would really benefit from any, if you're planning to kind of type it up and kind of even in an unpublished or semi-published kind of form, if you're able to share with us, I think that would be really beneficial for most of us, I think. But while speaking about Bourdieu, and I think you also did a great job of actually walking us through many other kind of literary giants who influenced Bourdieu and who Bourdieu conversed with. And in that sense, his own kind of discourse has been modified and modified so many times that the ultimate meaning actually might be slightly different from the original meaning. And so I think it's really particularly good to have this kind of long traditional sort of discourse and understanding Bourdieu. So in that context, what I wanted to ask you was maybe, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and it's through that lens that I've engaged tangentially with Bourdieu, but I think many students or faculty may have looked at it from that perspective as well. So this kind of point that you highlighted a couple of times yourself about Bourdieu as a practice theorist, somebody who relied quite a lot on his own upbringing as a kind of middle-class kind of child, which is not very common in French kind of philosophical circles. So in some ways, Bourdieu's life might be quite exceptional, and he has kind of rightly pointed out that personal experiences are important in terms of philosophical kind of journeys that a sociologist sort of take. And combined with that, his own engagement with, as you rightly pointed out again, Algerian national movement, which was probably one of the last sort of, anti-colonial movement vis-à-vis France, where Bourdieu as a kind of public philosopher was put himself at the front, which then kind of made him a public sort of sociologist as opposed to ivory tower philosopher on so many different walks of life. So in that perspective, I wanted to kind of ask you your perspectives on use of Bourdieusian kind of discourse in study of resistance as a kind of empowered social action. And it's saying this, and I think I'm influenced already by kind of repetitively that you have said. Bourdieu has borrowed quite a lot from traditional sociologists and traditional discourses, but his own tradition has been that of a protester than a legitimizer. So, for example, in terms of engaging with, do you think it's me? For example, when he engages with New Gantians, to start with, for example, that he accepts from them that symbolical kind of facts and cultural tools are part of it, are important part of the communication. But then in saying that, he's actually not endorsing completely the use of cultural space in an independent sort of way. He's questioning the kind of, it's a sort of questioning the use of this kind of framework, which kind of questioning we see again and again, whether for example, with Saussure about the linguistics as an underlying kind of semiotic system that guides our social action. Again, he's not actually agreeing with Saussure that the linguistic system is a completely comprehensive and fully fledged system. He actually questions its kind of structuredness, or this theme about a structure is a structured structure, and it's also a structuring structure. That's pretty much the central argument that he makes. And in that sense, I think he probably is, and he has conversed a lot with Marx and Althusser and others who have made resistance their part of kind of discourse. So, I think I would probably, after listening to you, probably it's safe to think of Bourdieu as a resistor, somebody who contests the given kind of paradigm. And in that sense, I wanted to ask you, how do you see Bourdieu applied in social resistance movements? Just to give you an example, for example, recently we had another speaker, Professor Michael Bourdieu. He has written a book, Conversations with Bourdieu, that talks about Bourdieuian discourse in a very specific context of the Joburg moment, which is the Johannesburg moment, which is, the anti-apartheid struggle was very much kind of casted as a Marxist struggle. So post-apartheid, after mid-1990s, but a lot has changed, not in a revolutionary sort of way, but as a continuity, but also kind of incremental continuity, where the positions taken by various parties are nuanced, not as explicit as the kind of class war, but something that has employed what he says then, the idea of symbolic violence, is that more applicable for Joburg after apartheid as opposed to the anti-apartheid movement. So in those kind of discussions, this is just an example, but I wanted to kind of hear from you any kind of comments you might have on applying Bourdieu in any kind of social circumstances.
As I mentioned, his earlier interventions were, in a sense, very low-key, and he did focus on use using symbolic means and arena of symbolic production for resistance, rather than active participation, say in political movements or in a party or in trade unions and so on. So he was perhaps more inclined to limit himself to a militant craftsmanship, as he put it, and to work within the domain of the symbolic through his scholarship. To that extent, there is, of course, a kind of more overt kind of involvement in movements and of resistance at a later stage of his life. And I think it has something to do with the enormity of the neoliberal sort of reality, which seemed to be so destructive and is so destructive at so many levels. And it was almost like, his experience of the destructiveness of colonialism had sensitized him to how culture and, it can be where destruction takes place and enters at very deep levels of human existence and the exploitation of people. So I would say that his ideas, as I pointed out, do talk about the relevance of participation in processes of change. But the concepts that he uses to describe it are relatively, or the theory of it is not so well worked out. And perhaps if he'd lived longer, he would have reflected on what was happening and what he was part of at a level which would have coalesced with his earlier theoretical work. And in fact, there is an anomaly insofar as, on the one hand, he sees symbolic power as exploitative, because he talks about how it generates misrecognition and can be subject to monopoly and so on. But on the other hand, he also talks about using symbolism and symbols as weapons in resistance towards not just cultural phenomena, but economic systems, as in the case of neoliberalism. So how is symbolic power liberatory, if it is inherently violent in some ways, in a symbolic way? So there is this kind of theoretical, there are these loose ends which do not enable one to see a theory of resistance and of resistance movements in his work. But his inclination towards movements that question authority, domination, and exploitation is clear enough. I don't know if this answers your question.
No, it does. I think it's more than looking for a but no, I mean, I'm like,
yes. I mean, that's true. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you very much. Again, as Malika had mentioned, this is really a comprehensive journey into the and I think it becomes very important not just for students but also for faculty too, in the end, to sort of re-engage with these sort of with many of. I mean, the point is that Bourdieu is not a philosopher, but he's a sociologist very critically, and we are all sociologists. I claim I'm to be an assistant professor of sociology, but I don't know about that's a different thing. Now, I mean, some questions which Malika and Grace, but I was also thinking. I'm trying to think back how I sort of encountered Bourdieu as a student many years ago. And it was the Kabyle House. It was so it was from a very kind of anthropological view of doing detail, like a detailed observation. Which is why I found when you're talking about husband or objectivation, also again rather interesting, because I was wondering one of these things. So within anthropology, there is also an awareness of husband observation as being somewhat problematic. It may not have been overtly made, but for example, my supervisor in Tokyo would say, don't say you don't do husband observation, because the only way I could do husband observation, given the people I was working on, if I managed to get displaced and disowned and disinherited. I worked on displaced people, so that's why I use the term. But I was wondering that if then in that case, whether Bourdieu's engagement with husband objectivation was also sort of whether it was written independently or sort of also in awareness of these kinds of debates within the context of the project of anthropology, I mean, there are many situations where anthropologists have had to look at Bourdieu. I mean, the Kabyle House is a brilliant example. If you're a scholar of education, whether you're from sociology or anthropology, it doesn't matter. Bourdieu is what you engage with, simple as that. But I was wondering to what extent this kind of conversation between disciplines of sociology and anthropology involving Bourdieu happens. So we got a sense of Bourdieu with, say, philosophers, but even within the disciplines by itself. So that's one thing. I was also wondering, though, while we talk about this idea of understanding and explanation, it is also about, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea of also capturing, like the text, sort of reality as a text, but giving a much more complicated approach to it than hermeneutics as suggested. The thing that's very striking about Bourdieu is also this. In anthropology, well, let's just say in sociology, you have a divide between the quantitative scholars and the qualitative scholars. So like a quantity versus quality fight. And it's a very sharp divide. Either you're on this side or that side. And the thing is that Bourdieu is one scholar who actually used to cross this boundary phenomenon. Like Kabyle House is pretty much as an example of good ethnographic fieldwork, but then a lot of his studies in France were based on large scale. Yeah, distinction. I mean, it's a kind of scale which he was able to straddle, method and scale. I was wondering then, in what case does method and the kinds of data feature in these discussions as well when we look at the question of text? We read a kind of social reality, but we're also looking at different ways of representing that social reality, whether it be ethnographic fieldwork, whether it be quantitative data, survey issues. And I was wondering whether this concern with method and the types of data also feature in these discussions.
I think in that sense he is, again, somewhat innovative, because if you go by conventional methods, then anthropology would do ethnography and sociology would do survey work. But unlike the run-of-the-mill survey work, a study like distinction, on the one hand it uses quantitative analysis, and on the other hand there are a whole lot of photographs, there's a whole lot of reporting of conversations, descriptions of habitats, and so I think there is a crossing of not just statistical and ethnographic, but also quantitative and qualitative in general. And moreover, his use of statistics, I think it is very, very important to be noted as theoretically informed and as having a rigor which is unusual. I mean, the meaning that emerges from his quantitative data is of a depth, because the questions or the construction of the categories has been done in such a brilliant way. And as far as the Kabir house is concerned, he later looks upon it as the work of a committed structuralist, which he sees to be later, although it is an extremely meaningful and evocative kind of
it's practically a model also for students
yeah.
as well. You want to see
Oh,
how
yeah.
to do it.
He does move away from that structured kind of structuralism in his later reflections on method and his work. But his notion of participant objectivation is, I think, something that crystallized later. Because once again, if you look at Algeria 1960, or for that matter, even distinction, there is no component of that, sort of reflexivity manifest in it. But it's something he again arrived at and saw as something to be fixed virtually, to get rid of certain problems that emerge if you don't do it, and as a potential kind of tool for analysis. But it's true, as far as his dialogue with anthropology, with the field of anthropology is concerned, he has had things to say about contemporary trends, such as, Marcus and Fisher's work and so on, which are extremely critical. And they follow from his view that there is a kind of, postmodernist inspired irresponsibility and nihilism, and therefore a kind of self-indulgent way of doing things or putting them across. But although it is in the guise of, solicitude for the marginalized other, the other pole of the hierarchized binary, and so on. So, I think he was very much, a part of what was happening beyond, sociology and into anthropology as well. He presents again a very good example of probably the irrelevance of this whole division between sociology and anthropology, and it's inherent in his work, which even in the case of a complex society like France is not divested of ethnographic power,
Questions? Okay, I have a question. So at the end of your lecture, I would like to say that Bourdieu takes side of science. We take the science versus, let's say, other forms of knowledge, and he also takes side of reason in reason-emotion divide. So given that Bourdieu's whole life he has devoted to bridging these binaries, deconstructing these binaries, and also taking note from both sides of the binary, but also criticizing these binaries. So what do you think? Ultimately, critics have said that Bourdieu ultimately is objectivist, is scientist, but he also on the reason side, in the reason versus emotion binary. So you also seem to be arguing along similar line.
Well, perhaps if I had more time and I could say more in detail what his position is, I would say that he, in fact, does not accept these binaries. Because when he talks about science, as I tried to argue, he in fact talks about science as a form of knowledge creation, which is equally what is there in the so-called humanities, or in the arts, or in even the natural science. So, this all, again, that dichotomous conception, even though he calls it science, because to that extent, he is, yes, he does prioritize objectification, and that he's stated very clearly. But as far as reason and emotion is concerned, once again, his integration, or rather merging of understanding and explanation implies overcoming the duality of reason and emotion as well. Now, reason, of course, yes, emotion is subjected to a process of reasoning, and objectification. But that does not negate the value of emotion. Or, in order to explain, you may have to objectify. But in order to understand, you may need to sympathize and empathize. And both forms of knowledge come together in his oeuvre. And yet you are right to point out that objectification is one of his aims in creating, or what would be called a scientific discipline.
No, extending this kind of earlier discussion about Bourdieu across disciplines. Okay, art and kind of material sciences, qualitative, quantitative, anthropology, sociology, so it just goes on. But one of the things that kind of came to my mind is economics and culture. And we sort of don't find that many people who are as much enthusiastically sort of looked at in the economics kind of discipline and sociology. In fact, I was aware that Douglas North, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for Economics for his work on institutionalism, where he sort of said that markets are, okay, this is free market kind of idea at some level, but then they are also underpinned with deep-seated sort of institutions, which may be formal, informal institutions in making institutions already kind of old for several generations, etc. But for explaining that, he actually found it really useful to engage with Bourdieu's idea of, again,
his critique of rational aspect theory.
Absolutely.
Is very, very germane to his, reflections on economics, because he questions the assumption of rational calculation being the basis of human action.
Absolutely.
And that's where the notion of practical logic becomes a counterpoint to rational behavior presumed by economics. And in fact, his critique of neoliberalism does go beyond the world of politics and culture into the economic impact. So to that extent, yes, I think economics was part of what engaged him, and not just economic life, but economics as a discipline. At its basic assumptions and the problems with them, and what therefore they spawn in terms of systems of material existence. So I think, you know, as you rightly pointed out, he's been involved and engaged with such diverse fields that you name it, and you know, and you mentioned economics. Yes, I mean, you know, there is, you know, Bourdieu on economics.
And that comes as kind of a bit surprised that another kind of French theorist, Marcel Mauss, who explicitly engaged this idea of gift and exchange.
Yes.
But in fact, then when you look at the contemporary and maybe sort of neoliberal economists, Marcel Mauss is really registered among them, you know, whereas Bourdieu seems to have come to this kind of more natural
Marcel Mauss, the connection between Mauss and neoliberal economics?
Well, Mauss is an economic categories was theorizing more on the more explicitly economic topics like exchange of gift. And he wanted to influence economists. But I think what's found among the economists is actually more of resistance, that it sort of interferes with the contemporary notion of how the market works, particularly neoliberally kind of influenced sort of view. Whereas Bourdieu, I think many kind of see as neutral to this dichotomy of neoliberal versus Marxist.
I don't think he's neutral at all. He's very critical of neoliberalism.
He is the
very overt, and he's written about it.
But he's also quite critical of Marxism.
Well, I wouldn't say that he demolishes Marx or you know, goes against Marx. But as I said, in a sense, he builds and moves in certain ways beyond the limitations of Marx's canvas, which doesn't mean that he's in contradiction, you know. And of course, yes, I mean, he's critical of Marxism in certain forms, he's critical of Marxist politics of a certain kind, no doubt about it. But I think that there's a lot that he's taken from Marx and the Marxist tradition. And he's you know, moved and innovated and, you know, but it's true that, you know, the fact that his definition of capital or his definition of capitalism doesn't talk about surplus value, you know, doesn't talk about exploitation as such, except when he's, you know, reflecting on neoliberalism. So there is, in fact, another shift towards an engagement with issues which, you know, conventionally a Marxist would engage with, you know, in the case of his later work.
I agree, yeah, but keeping this kind of framework that allows a slightly kind of more engaged thinking from convergence of the defense of capital, for example, in explaining the reproduction of class and any form of symbolic violence.
Yes, no, it has its own, you know, contribution. I'm not saying that it doesn't, you know, do anything theoretically, but I'm just saying that there is, you know, a difference between the Marxist view of what capital is and what Bourdieu says, or you know, the understanding of domination and subordination in terms of exploitation via, you know, the extraction of surplus value. It does not figure in, you know, Bourdieu's framework. So there's no doubt about it, and that he's taken something built on other beats. But he's not a wholesale Marxist. No, he isn't.
I think for those who are looking for a sort of middle ground out of Marxism, I think he provides a new sort of framework, which is kind of practical.
For that matter, the very fact that, you know, apart from hierarchies of class, he talks about ethnicity, he talks about gender, he talks about, you know, other forms of subordination and, you know, superordination. Which is where, in any case, the social sciences are going, you know, from that focus, you know, myopic view in terms of class alone to the more diversified, you know, picture of what reality is.
Yeah, somehow overlapping with what she was trying to raise. First of all, thanks a lot. It was such a fantastic lecture. I always, whenever it comes to Bourdieu, I feel like a naive learner, and I always like to come to you and listen to you and understand it better. But yeah, so some of these naive questions would be like, for example, I understand that he is not a wholesale Marxist, no doubt about it. But is it possible, does he make references or does he acknowledge anything coming from Gramsci for that matter? Because there is a lot of sense of praxis here, and you ended it with the stress on praxeology, if one has to understand Bourdieu as a theorist, as an actor in the field. So I was just feeling if you could throw some light on possible connection or Bourdieu probably acknowledging, borrowing things from Gramsci, or for that matter the changed situation in the post-Second World War situation, when you have all kind of changes happening in political Marxism, Trotsky's questioning and political Marxism taking different route altogether, Frankfurt School emerging, and 50s is the time when Frankfurt School is at its peak, and Horkheimer, Adorno, all of them at their peak. I was wondering if that is also a light, in addition to the postmodern critique, to which also it seems that he is theoretically responding. Similarly, does he also respond to this new neo-Marxist and new-left situation? And probably that might help us understand the connection. Yeah, that is number one. Number two, and this is very, very naive. I always wondered, as a student also, I used to wonder if habitus is all about my structured and structuring disposition, and there is a possibility of fluidity in it, and my practical logic would certainly, I operate in my practical logic, I operate with binaries, no doubt. But I also, as you rightly try to point out, I also go beyond these binaries. I mean, it's not a linear sequence of binaries. Yes, no, black, white, good, bad. I also from bad become good, good become white. So yes, black. It keeps moving to and fro and becomes such a jumble that I feel that things are very fuzzy. My judgment is extremely fuzzy at times. And most of the time, in my practical situation, I find most of the time my judgment is fuzzy. I may hate to have BlackBerry mobile, but in the meantime, I may have a liking for the kind of sleek gadget it will be, right? So I may hate to possess it, but if it comes my way, probably I will not hate it completely, right? So that is the fuzziness is being highlighted here. If that is the situation, if the fuzziness is the reality, if my habitus is structured and structuring disposition, is it possible to really objectify reality completely?
Yeah, I think, and to come to your last question first, I think Bourdieu wouldn't try and endorse an attempt to do that, to totally objectify. And which is why, even his notion of truth, as I pointed out, is always an approximation. He does not believe in those absolutes that positivism seems to, flaunt. And now to come to your first question, Gramsci, he has somewhere, referred to his work and said how it's different from his own, insofar as Gramsci, in a way, talks about the manufacture of consent and so on. Whereas for Bourdieu, it is a much more subliminal and, not a conscious project, so to speak. And as far as, what was your second question about the Marxists, Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxists, and I think, again, I just sort of recollect reading here and there in Bourdieu how he's critical of the philosophical ambitions of the Frankfurt School. He sees that as a kind of not very sound way of looking at social reality. And its ambitions are suspect for Bourdieu. And he's more inclined not to Merton's middle range theory, but a much more empirically grounded and that kind of work. There was another question about the fuzzy logic. Yeah. Oh, that was the last. And
what you're not talking about.
Yeah.
Your presentation is fantastic, and I am a very new reader and good those. So I have one confusion that is structure produce habitus or habitus produce structure?
It's a dialectic, and the habitus itself is structured for that matter. You know, so it's not it's not like individual versus society, but rather it is a system which is embodied from the environment, and not just the material environment, but also the symbolic environment, and which in turn responds in particular situations in probably unpredictable ways at times, you know, from situation to situation. So it's a dialectical relationship if one must use structure versus habitus. And yet, yeah, and actually you're right, I think Bourdieu also uses these two terms as, you know, separate entities, theoretically.
As Bourdieu talks about various forms of capitals, and he also talks about the conversion of those capitals within themselves. So I would like to know about that. I want to know about, can we talk about the generality of those conversions? Because when it converts, it might differ. It's very individual. When cultural capital converts into social capital, this kind of. So can we talk about the generality? Is it possible to generalize the conversion as an action itself?
I'm not sure I know what you mean, but I mean, what is general is the fact that there can be conversions, and what is also common to all notions of capital is that they are forms of value, and thirdly that symbolic capital is a component of all forms of capital. You know, it's not necessarily a separate form of capital. For example, for economic capital to function as manifest in money, you need people to accept the value symbolically of, you know, that piece of paper or whatever, and so on and so forth. So what does cut across different kinds of capital, to that extent is general, is symbolic capital, which is a component of all forms of capital and their efficacy.
It was indeed a great lecture to hear about Bourdieu. Since we know the topic, I was just looking at it and I just thought that, you know, let's try to connect Bourdieu, since we are reading Bourdieu today, as the topic says. So I thought if we connect Bourdieu into the contemporary times, say South Asia or India in particular, we know that Bourdieu talks of, as you said, that it talks about symbolic capital and cultural capital, and he talks and he says that in a society, economic capital is not the source way of getting, you know, of power. It's the symbolic capital and cultural capital plays a dominant role in determining what exactly I would say who is in power and who gets the dominant. It's kind of, I would say that, you know, he says that he talks of symbolic capital and cultural capital as important factors in a society, and he says that there are those who have symbolic capitals, those who have cultural capital do always have an upper hand. Kind of like, you know, the forms, or kind of like they are always in, you know, in a way they can they have a kind of dominance in the society. If I have the cultural capital, I would be in kind of a better state in any society. So if we situate that in the contemporary times, in a country like India, where there are diverse cultures that exists, so can I really say that there is a kind of a dominant culture that exists? And if I say that that there is a certain one fixed symbolic capital that exists today, and if I do not have that symbolic capital, I am losing out. And I am having I need to attain that dominant symbolic capital in order to achieve certain goals, achieve certain educational skills, achieve certain training. And if I do not have it, I lose out. So as a person, as an Indian, where do I locate myself if I apply Bourdieu's sense of capital and symbolic capital and cultural capital in a country like India and in a region like South Asia in particular?
That's a very interesting question. But one thing that I'd like to clarify is that these forms of capital are not optional forms. It says that somebody has symbolic capital, somebody else has economic capital. But as he lays it out in his study called Distinction, there are various class fractions in French society, for example, which have different components of these different forms of capital, with something dominant and something less, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more kind of complex and, in a sense, realistic picture of class structure that emerges when you see even individuals or groups in terms of the varying composition of different forms of capital in their whatever social context. That's one thing. But as far as the use of these, the notion of these forms of capital in India or in South Asia is concerned, I mean, one very obvious aspect or reality that seems to call for the use of a notion such as that of symbolic capital is that of caste. You know, where there is a hierarchy regardless perhaps of economic capital. And so the dominance of certain forms of symbolic capital and its role in people's lives can be seen in terms of how the caste system is part of this region, more or less, you know, everywhere. And then it would be very interesting to map classes or groups in Indian society on the basis of these different forms of capital. I mean, take, for instance, the nouveau riche, you know, who have economic capital but not cultural capital. I think we can think of such groups in Indian society. You know, whether it's the rural, newly rich, and so on and so forth. Similarly, we can think of the, culturally and economically loaded, old bourgeoisie, maybe, or, and so on and so forth. So, I would say that these, in a sense, are universal conceptual categories that could be, used, of course, as I pointed out, heuristically, rather than as substantive and, reified categories, to understand the dynamics of, stratification, mobility, and, even cultural patterning in a society like India or any other South Asian country. I don't know if I've been able to respond adequately to your question, but you obviously have been thinking about, how Bourdieu is relevant you know, if we are studying a society like India, and that is a very important thing to you know, reflect on.
Indian society can be as in Indian society it could be as difficult to imply the very notion of symbolic capital in terms of, because see, it can be, I wouldn't say difficult, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, because?
Let's say because of the sense that, as I said, that the entire caste system, how it plays the role. Plus, not just caste system that is prevalent today, it's all about how there are certain dominant political groups also coming up and playing an important role in terms of having a hold over certain form of capital in the society, if not economic. Then they have a hold over symbolic capital, and they are running the mind of the people. So how that plays an important role in the society, and how people would actually look at it as something to aspire for, as in that sense. If we talk about politically driven groups, or in larger South Asian context as well. So that can be an interesting thing to apply.
Yes, because I mean, Bourdieu does in fact give you know, a kind of basic importance to economic capital. I mean, I think, you know, to that extent, he is within a so-called, you know, Marxist tradition. And it would then be interesting to see whether in societies such as ours, that is really, you know, the determining factor, or is it, as you pointed out, something else in forms of culture, forms of symbolic power and capital. And I mean, you know, these are just, you know, sort of tools, you know, which can be sort of used. And again, as I said, you know, he says they're meaningless except in terms of empirical research, and then they can be modified. So, you know, there is a tendency to, and I have done it myself, to see Bourdieu as a theorist, but somewhere that is a violation of his entire approach. You know, you can see him as a theorist, but not apart from empirical work. Ideally, I mean, you know, or rather, if one is, you know, if one is true to the Bourdieu spirit.
We have one more. We have one last.
Okay, last question.
Ma'am, we have been doing Bourdieu from this semester, and we, as the students, we will start our research from, I mean, you know, we have started learning about it. And I feel that there is an anxiety between all of us, because, I mean, the things that are coming to us now is like what we should do and what we should avoid. And I mean, while doing research. So there was one reading by Bourdieu where he talks that a researcher should unmask the methods like codification and diagrams and all that he uses in a research methodology. My question is, if a young scholar, I mean a young researcher like me, is involved in unmasking the methods, I mean, then I think I'll be lost.
No, I think, you know, these things sound very vague, like unmasking. What it just means is that look at the assumptions that have gone into the creation of a particular category or a question. You know, rather than just take it as a technique with no theoretical import, because only then is the use of certain methods, you know, a movement towards research, you know, because otherwise, you know, you can just go on tabulating and so on, but what does it mean? And this is not a heavyweight kind of thing. You know, this is literally just using your common sense to ask, why am I using this classification? Or why are these figures important? What do they mean? Simple as that. That is what he calls unmasking. Thank you.
Okay, so we have come to an end. I would like to thank Professor Jain for accepting our invitation and coming all the way to Southeast University. I would also like to thank the audience for their patience and for raising stimulating questions. And tea and snacks, right? So waiting for us, and let's meet them and then we'll continue this discussion there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is very, very exciting.